Hello, listeners. My name is Nitkun Singh, and welcome to the World War II Mysteries podcast. Today, we'll be going in depth about Canada's economy from the 1920s until the end of World War II, beginning with the 1920s economy with a special guest and economic expert, Salian Brijesh.
Hey Nitkan, glad to be here.
So, Salian, can you explain the economic state of the country in 1920s to our listeners?
Gladly. So, in the 1920s, the First World War had just ended and there were many problems, causing economic downturn in Canada. Many industries were no longer needed in such high demand. For example, the ammunition industry no longer needed to produce ammo at such a high rate. Therefore, factories were closed and employees were laid off. Imagine this trend happening across many different and diverse industries. Now, that was one of the causes of the poor economy, but Canada's lower exports and imports were also a cause. After the war, the US raised taxes on exports from Canada, significantly affecting Canada's GDP, since the US is Canada's most lucrative trading partner. The European countries were in high debt from the war and could not afford to continue purchasing Canadian exports. Global trade slowed down, and Canada no longer needed such a high amount of wheat, lowering wheat prices, meaning that prairie farmers were suffering, some even leaving their farms to find a job in the city. However, by the mid 1920s, the economy started to improve. The price of wheat increased, repairing the economy in the prairies. We can see a similar scenario in the Maritimes, where steel, fish, and coal prices dropped significantly before the mid 1920s. The Maritimes, being based on these primary resources, suffered and striked. A popular strike that occurred in the Maritimes is the 1922 to 1925 Cape Breton strike. The coal miners were angry after a wage reduction and went on strike. Now, the reason why the economy improved in the mid 1920s is because the demand for Canadian goods increased as other countries repaired their economies, showing just how interconnected all countries' economies are. Here, we notice a common trend of cause and consequence, where the war caused countries to be in heavy debt. In turn, global trade slowed down, lowering the value of primary resources in Canada because those were Canada's main exports, and lowering the price of wheat, coal, steel, and fish. This causes factory owners and farmers to lose money, forcing owners to lay off employees or lower wages, and farmers to find other jobs. When workers are paid less, they strike, like the Cape Breton strike or the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919. The economic recovery of the mid 1920s led to the Roaring Twenties. People could afford things like refrigerators or cars. The value of gasoline increased as cars became more popular. When this was combined with the discovery of petroleum in Alberta, Canada gained more money from this. Suddenly, people had plenty of money, and they started investing in the stock market, sometimes on margin, planning to pay off the loan with the profit they made.
Interesting. So this leads to into the economic state during the Great Depression, which was marked by significant transformations as the nation healed from war and stock market crash.
Mind telling us more about this intriguing topic?
Of course not. Here's a full overview. The 1930s was an incredible tough time for Canadians. The Great Depression, which began in 1929, defined the decade with severe economic challenges. As an export-dependent nation, Canada was hit especially hard when the global markets collapsed. Key industries like wheat farming and resource extraction suffered massive losses. In the prairies, wheat prices plummeted from about $250 a bushel in 1928 to less than 40 cents by 1932. While a severe drought turned farmland into dust, creating the Dust Bowl, the environmental disasters forced thousands of families off their farms, many heading west to search for work. Unemployment skyrocketed by 30% by 1933, leaving millions without steady incomes. Relief payments were introduced, but often inadequate. For example, a family of 5 in Toronto might receive $19 per month. The government established relief camps in 1932 to provide jobs for single unemployment men. But conditions were harsh and workers were earning only 20 cents a day for hard labor. Frustrations over 3 conditions culminated in onto Ottawa Trek of 1935, where thousands of workers demanded for better support.
I'd like to add that if we take the historical perspective of a citizen during the 1930s, we can see that they did not think much of government relief, considering they would suffer greatly in spite of the relief, and negatively refer to it as "pogie." In 1930, Canadians reeled from the Depression. People were losing jobs and became unable to pay their debts. If they bought anything on margin, they would have no money to repay the loans with, leading to repossession of their appliances, homes, and other valuables. Some jobs would not pay enough to repay the loans, exhausting all the options available for workers and leaving them to rely on pogie to survive. Soup kitchens and relief camps saved many from starvation.
Thank you for that dive into historical perspective, Salin. Afterwards, in 1939, Canada declared war on Germany, making a dramatic economic turnaround. Wartime production created an enormous demand for goods, reviving industries and creating jobs. Factories shifted to producing military vehicles, tanks, and aircrafts, making Canada a leading wartime producer. The aviation and shipbuilding industries also flourished, with Canada producing over 16,000 military aircraft and more than 400 naval vessels. Farmers benefiting from government prices guarantees contributed significantly by supplying food for domestic use and allied forces. One of the most significant changes during World War II was the increased participation of women in the workforce. By 1944, about 1 in 3 workers in war industries were women, breaking traditional gender barriers. To finance the war, the government raised taxes, introduced popular victory bonds, and implemented economic controls such as freezing wages and prices, which ensured essential resources were directed towards the war effort, limited items like butter, sugar, and gasoline. By the war's end in 1945, Canada's economy had been transformed. The GDP nearly doubled, employment was virtually eliminated. Unemployment was virtually eliminated, and Canada emerged as an industrial power. Socially, women's workforce contributed contributions, and the government's expanded economic role set the stage for post-war prosperity and policy shifts in the 1950s. The economical challenges during World War II era were historically significant as they marked a major shift in Canada's economy. The Great Depression had left the country in dire economic situation, but the war effort brought a dramatic recovery. Wartime production led to a surge in industrial demand, which helped end the depression. Government intervention, including rationing, wage freezes, and introducing war bonds, played a crucial role in stabilizing the economy. These measures not only financed the war but also set a foundation for post-war economic policies. Additionally, the war created social change, with women entering the workforce in large numbers, which helped to break traditional gender barriers, as said earlier. The economic transformation also solidified Canada's status as an industrial powerhouse, enhancing its global role and establishing a more independent national identity. This era shaped Canada's economic and social landscape for decades to come.
Wow. It's fascinating how this period, though marked by hardship and suffering, ultimately reshaped Canada's economy and society, isn't it?
It most certainly is. And with that, we have arrived to our end of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and make sure to stay tuned in next week.